All right, welcome back everybody to another edition of the Backyard Natural Resources webinar series. This is our last one, so the recordings for the 3 previous ones are up on YouTube or will be soon, and this one will be joining it once it concludes. And today I'll be presenting along with Robin Buterbaugh, and she is our horticulture field specialist in Sioux Falls. I am an urban entomologist based in Pierce, South Dakota, and I'm going to be covering some backyard biodiversity about why insects matter. In the meantime, if anyone has questions, feel free to throw those into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Keep an eye on the chat. That's where we'll put links to resources and some evaluations at the end of the presentations. So I'll do the first half, and then Robin's got the second half, and we'll both hopefully have some time to take some questions at the very end of the presentation. So Robin, anything to add before I get started?
Nope, I don't think so. I'll be talking about biodiversity as far as plants go, so we'll
Yep.
have things covered.
Yep, and I've seen Robin's slides, and it's going to be a great kind of synthesis of everything that we've been learning over the past 3 sessions. So hopefully, if folks weren't able to join us for this one today, if they've joined us before, they catch the recording. So, and there's no test or anything, but it's let's see. All right, screen share is loading. Preview looks good. Awesome. Okay, so yeah, why do insects matter? If any of you have met me before, you know I'm very much an insect evangelist. I want more people to care about insects and think that they are neat and let them live on their properties, on land they manage, let them hang out and do their thing. I like sharing this graphic of insect diversity over geologic time. It gives you some nice silhouettes of some of the common orders of insects. So you can see the Odonata, our dragonflies and damselflies, our beetles, our Coleoptera, Diptera, our flies. And the width of those black bars is sort of the estimated, number of genera or families at that time. And you can see that our flies, our bees, wasps, and ants, the Hymenoptera down there in the corner, our Coleoptera are all some of our most diverse groups of insects. So when you think about what you might be seeing in your garden or in your landscape, some of those insects that are going through complete metamorphosis are the ones that you're going to be seeing sort of the most of, just because they are the most diverse at this point in time. You can also see some of the different families or different orders that went extinct. So kind of sad that we don't have trilobites still around. They would probably be pretty cool. But this is just to illustrate that there are lots of insects out there, lots of beetles out there, lots of flies out there. And I'm going to go through what those insects are doing in our environment. So what do insects and their allies, so thinking about some of the other arthropods out there, our millipedes, our centipedes, our spiders, things that are, phylum Arthropoda, but not class Insecta. Those are the allies. But what are they doing for the environment? We have members that are decomposers. Decomposition out in nature is very important. If you're somebody who does, backyard composting, you know this, and you've maybe observed some critters in your compost pile that are helping move things along. But without decomposers, we would all be like waist deep in just absolute grossness. So decomposers are vital to our ecosystem. We also obviously have pollinators. Probably don't need to say much about them at this point. They are sort of our gateway insect, especially the butterflies, because they're pretty, they're cute, they're fuzzy, and they do something that is very obviously beneficial to people, by pollinating our plants so that we can have the fruits and vegetables that we like to eat. And then I think sort of the underappreciated role are the biomass movers, things that are, by way of their feeding, might actually be something you consider a pest. However, that movement of taking that plant material and moving it up the food chain is really important. I mean, we learn from Laura about the grasslands and the birds that are out there and like that kind of an ecosystem. We need, some of those birds aren't directly eating the plants, but they're eating the insects that are eating the plants. And so those biomass movers are important in the ecosystem. And we can, part of my job is helping people sort of solve, their garden problems. And we can talk about how to, live in harmony with some of those biomass movers. And so I'm going to start with the decomposers and recyclers. Millipedes are super cute little tubes with lots of legs. They are diplopods, so they've got 2 pairs of legs per body segment. And I get calls about them a lot in South Dakota in the fall because they'll kind of wander into structures, in September, and they dry out and die pretty much immediately. They don't feed or reproduce indoors, but where they really want to be is out in your compost pile underneath the leaf litter, somewhere where it's damp, where they can be, chowing down on those rotting leaves and, turning that into frass and recycling those nutrients. So totally harmless, super cute little arthropods, but sometimes they end up being a pest for people just because they don't really understand their behavior. We also have pill bugs, which are kind of like shorter millipedes, 1 pair of legs per body segment, but these are isopods. They are terrestrial crustaceans, and we have loads of them in South Dakota. I always have a healthy population in my compost pile. If I pick up a container, I've got, containers of plants around my house. If I pick up one of those containers, usually there's some isopods underneath there hanging out, all different sizes, from the little small young ones to the full-size adult isopods. And these are the ones that if you poke them, they'll roll up. But they do, very sort of similar things to the millipedes as far as decomposing, rotting plant material and just, being good to have outdoors, breaking that stuff down. Totally harmless to people. Earwigs are possibly some of our most misunderstood decomposers. They look creepy to a lot of people. Like, I get it. They don't have pretty wings. They've got this, these pinchers on the cerci on the end of their abdomen, and they're under things. They're in, cracks and crevices and dark corners of your garden. You'll find them under pots as well. They also need moisture to survive. So if these are a decomposer that you don't want to see, make sure you've got airflow under those pots. Elevate them, move them around often. That stuff kind of helps. Or just, work on learning to appreciate earwigs. They are some of our insects that do exhibit parental care. The mom earwig actually takes care of the young, which is pretty interesting. But yeah, they're usually not out there to do harm, but they are decomposers, and sometimes they get a little ambitious and chow down on healthy plant tissue, but that's only in sort of higher populations. Ants are also decomposers. They could also slot under the biomass movers as well. But they will pull, weed seeds. They'll recycle other insects. They move all sorts of nutrients into their colonies in order to feed to their larvae. A lot of people want to go to war with ants because they'll show up in places that they don't, really appreciate them. You can absolutely do things to keep them out of your house, but as far as ants in the landscape, you're never going to win against them. And so, hopefully more people will come to understand, ants as a social organism. Here in South Dakota, we don't have fire ants. We don't have to worry about some of those really spicy species from the southern part of the US. The ants that we have, we've got, turf ants, pavement ants, like sidewalk ants, the mound builders, and they are legion, and you are not going to win against them, but they are out there, like I said, pulling weed seeds in, taking apart other insects like this fallen dragonfly that was in my on my sidewalk a couple years ago. But yeah, they're doing good work moving things around in the ecosystem. Flies are big decomposers, especially in their larval stage, aka maggots. So if you've ever had the, misfortune of, having a, squashed squirrel in the neighborhood or somewhere, they'll get colonized pretty quick by some of our carrion flies and other flies that go for sort of dead things. But they're really valuable in helping to, get those nutrients put back into the soil, turning themselves into tasty little morsels that other organisms like to eat. But yeah, flies, they kind of get a little bit of a bad rap because they have some members of their, order that are bitey, but they are important decomposers in the ecosystem. Obviously the pollinators, I feel like, we start out with decomposers, then we've got like the palate cleanser of the pollinators are things that are beautiful and fuzzy. They like to visit the flowers that we enjoy. We've got a nice bumblebee here on, I think this was one of my cup plants last year. And you can see that it's just covered in pollen all over its body. In addition to being packed on the legs, pollinators are anything that moves pollen from flower to flower. Obviously, a lot of native bee species, like these squash bees hanging out in a squash blossom, are bumblebees. They're big, they're fuzzy, they're charismatic. And we have a lot of projects out there that are looking to understand more about bumblebees. So if you're somebody who is like looking to get more involved in community science and bumblebees are something that really interests you or something that you'd like to learn more about, I'll put in a plug here for the Bumblebee Atlas. We're in the Great Plains region of the project. There are grid cells across the state of South Dakota. We have quite a few in some of the more remote areas that have never been sampled, and I know they're looking for folks to sample those. They're training, there's recorded YouTubes, and there's a lot of great printed material or PDFs that you can print out that have some like quick ID guides to the bumblebees that are in our region. We've got about 25 species, so it's not like an overwhelming number. But if you're into bumblebees and you'd like to learn more, Bumblebee Atlas is a great place to start, and I know they could always use more volunteers. We also have our cute little longhorn bees. These are just like cool pictures of bees. But if you're out in your yard and you've never sort of taken the time to check out what's happening in the flowers, if you walk with your shadow behind you, you can sneak up on the insects a little bit more easily, snap some pictures with your cell phone camera, put them up on iNaturalist to get some identifications, or just, share them with friends. But a lot of these native bees, the males will like sleep in flowers. So that's a really, really cute behavior and easy to observe in the evening when it's a little bit cooler. You can see a green metallic bee hanging out here in a wildflower at the Badlands. So, our pollinators are everywhere. We are trying to create some more of that pollinator habitat in our, urban and suburban spaces, which is what Robin's going to talk about. But if you're out on a hike, you can, non-destructively observe the wildflowers and see what pollinators are visiting. Obviously, we've got our monarch butterflies, caterpillars, total biomass movers, but the adults do visit flowers and are considered pollinators. And I did want to share this image where I have both the painted lady and the monarch right next to each other so folks can see the difference. And then like the one time I photographed a live viceroy over there on the right, that is a mimic of the monarch butterfly. You can see very similar colors, but just a little bit different wing venation patterns. So that's your, cocktail party fact for the afternoon as far as these three somewhat look-alike species. We also have predators that are moving biomass through the ecosystem. So these are insects and arthropods that are eating other insects and arthropods. Things like our green lacewings. So green netted wings, gold eyes, they'll come to your lights at night. So you've probably encountered them. Their larvae look like even more alligatory than the ladybug larvae look. They have really big pinchers on the front of their heads that they use to stab aphids and suck out their juices. So for predators to be hanging around, doing work in the ecosystem, you do need to have some sort of, baseline prey population. I never worry about managing aphids in my yard because I end up with a lot of syrphid flies, a lot of lacewings, a lot of ladybugs, and I just let them chow down. I also have a soft spot for aphids, so that helps as well. But these are some great predators. This picture includes an ambush bug that there was a little skipper going to that thistle, and the skipper ended up having a bad day because that ambush bug was waiting there to grab it. So we do have some really just interesting insect predators out there in the world. Also like this one, this assassin bug that's actually trying to mimic an ant. Really looks like a flying ant, landed on my hand, and I was like, oh, this is actually a true bug. How interesting. Um, the one meme I included in this, but wasps are also valuable in our ecosystem. They get a bad rap because of the stinging, But they are predators and they are pollinators. So they will hunt caterpillars and other soft-bodied insects to feed to their young. Obviously, the cicada killer wasp over there on the left specializes in cicadas. So again, moving some of that insect biomass to a different part of the food chain. Also, their behavior of ground nesting in the case of cicada killer wasps, and even yellow jackets are going to be doing things like, providing some aeration to some of our harder soils in South Dakota. Velvet ants, they get kind of an interesting rap because one of their nicknames is the cow killer, but they're actually a solitary ground nesting wasp. I consider them a really good biodiversity indicator because they do feed on ground nesting bees. And so you might think, well, that's terrible. They're eating our bees. But if you have a habitat that has enough ground nesting bees that it can support a velvet ant, that means that you're doing great things for ground nesting bees. So I consider them to be like, sort of kind of like a top apex predator of insects that give you an idea that, there's some good habitat there if you've got the ground nesting bees that they need to survive. And also they'll generally be booking it away from you, so it's super hard to get a picture of them like not running super fast. Tarantula hawks, cricket hunters, all sorts of cool solitary ground nesting wasps. Spiders, yes, you should be cool with spiders. They're gorgeous. They eat things. Um, be nice to your wolf spiders. Don't kill them. The moms carry their babies around on their back. So if you squish it, you run the risk of ending up with like 50 tiny spiders then running around your garage. Big fan of catch and release for spiders. But they'll hang out in your potted plants, looking adorable, making nets or making webs, hunting other insects. Um, don't try this at home, but you can. I have handled spiders, no ill effects. But yeah, spiders are a very important part of the ecosystem, and they're a nice generalist predator. Leave them outside. The ones that end up inside probably don't want to be there. Help them find their way back to the environment where they can do the most good. So the herbivores, some of our more controversial biomass movers, because these are the insects that are chowing down on things that we would also like to eat, produce, or otherwise get a high yield out of. I have some soybean aphids here. Obviously, huge pest of soybean. Can be managed with natural enemies, but also with chemicals in certain situations. Unless you're growing edamame in your backyard, you probably don't have to worry about soybean aphids. But just, aphids as a whole are the plankton of the garden world. There's lots of things that eat them, like I talked about, lacewings, syrphids, ladybugs. There's a whole host of parasitoid wasps that specialize in aphids. You need to have some aphids out there if you're going to have those predator populations. Those predators aren't going to hang around if there's nothing for them to eat. This is an example of Aphis nerrii, which is a milkweed aphid. It specializes in milkweed. It's got that bright yellow color, much like many things that feed on milkweed have some sort of, warning coloration. They're like, hey, I'm feeding on milkweed. I don't taste super great. But what's interesting here in this picture is you can see some of the winged adults that are going to be moving to, other milkweed to, have their babies and increase their colony. But there's also some like darker aphids in there that have actually been parasitized. The parasitoid wasp lays its egg in there, egg hatches, consumes the aphid, uses the aphid as its like pupal chamber, and then cuts a little escape hatch and flies off. So aphids are sort of the base of some really interesting insect food chains. Cicadas are some of my favorites. But they are tasty little tree screamers. We got lots of birds that eat them, especially, the periodical cicadas, which we don't have in South Dakota, which is very sad. We just haven't had trees for a long enough period of time for the periodical cicadas to have ever considered us a place to live. But in places that do have the periodical cicadas, there are a huge influx of nutrients, every 13 years or so. We do have annual cicadas, so we do have those critters that are living in the soil, feeding on tree roots. not enough to do any damage, but then they're providing some great aeration as they're moving out of the soil in July and August. And then they are fat and tasty for, birds and other critters, once they emerge. Our defoliators, so these are things that are feeding directly on leaf tissue, like our grasshoppers. It's probably going to be a good year for grasshoppers. Right now, everything is pretty green and lush in South Dakota, so we're not noticing them moving into crops or gardens, but that's going to be something to keep an eye out for later. But even, caterpillars, grasshoppers, lots of food for birds out there. These are some Gorgon checker spot caterpillars on a stiff sunflower plant. So these are going to turn into a tiny little butterfly that we think is really cool. So if you want to have some of those cool butterflies out there, you gotta let those caterpillars chow down on some plants. Like this black swallowtail really enjoys, dill, parsley, carrots. If those are in your garden, I just try to plant more of those so that there's enough for me and enough for the caterpillars. Japanese beetles, really some efficient defoliators and not a native beetle to South Dakota or the United States. So these are ones that we do kind of try to manage just because of the out of proportion damage that they can do to a landscape. But they are moving some of that plant material through the food web. But yeah, I caught Grace's master's defense yesterday, and I learned a lot about the tentacles on monarch caterpillars and how you can use those to tell the age of the caterpillar. So I want to say that this one's maybe a third instar, learning things every day from our other students and colleagues. But I really encourage folks to be cool with insects, let them exist in the ecosystem, and especially when creating these native habitats with native plants and things, understand that you are going to be bringing in these kinds of insects to your yard and to your space. I've had people who have called me asking like, well, we've got bumblebees flying around and we don't want them to sting the kids. Like, how do we get rid of bumblebees? And I'm like, you got to get rid of all the flowers. If you don't want bees around, you've got to like nuke their food source. But hopefully, more and more people are actually wanting to have bees around and wanting to understand how to live with these critters and including habitat for them. I'll real quick just go through some of the resources that are out there for insects and insect identification. Plugging one for South Dakota. If you're really into butterflies, there is the Field Guide to Butterflies of South Dakota that's printed through Game Fish and Parks. And then also, if you've got insects around and you want to know what they are, I'm here in the peer office, happy to take emails or pictures. And if it's something that you're like, this was definitely eating my kale, I want to kill it, throw it in a freezer, take a good picture, or send me a sample in a hard-sided container. And we also have our garden hotline staff around the state in Aberdeen, Sioux Falls, Pierre, and Rapid City that can also help to direct any questions to sort of the appropriate expert. So with that, I will put up this adorable picture of a bumblebee in a morning glory. And my contact information. And I'll take a look. It doesn't look like we've got any questions. Doesn't look like there's anything in the chat. Cool, I will stop sharing. And I know, Robin, how's your PowerPoint doing?
I think I'm okay.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll see. I changed some settings, so let's just try it out right this minute.
All right, I will turn it over to Robin and cross my fingers that technology cooperates with us.
Yep. How does that look?
Perfect. All right.
Nice. All right. Well, thank you very much, Amanda. And as many of you know, I'm the horticulture field specialist that just started here in January. And I've done most of my research on native plants when I was a graduate student. So of course, you're going to hear about native plants, but I'm going to try to expand the perspective a little bit beyond native plants and talk about all the different types of plant biodiversity that we can have in our backyards. And of course, if you were listening in on Tuesday to Laura's talk about grasslands, you'll have heard that grasslands are being converted to cropland and development. And that is, I mean, that is totally true. And because of that, we're seeing a huge, biodiversity loss, both with our plant and animal species, our insect species, due to agriculture and also due to urban and suburban development. It's estimated that by 2050, about 70% of the population will be living in urban areas. And of course, here in South Dakota, maybe you don't notice that quite as much. However, if you do live in, Brookings or Sioux Falls, I'm sure you're well aware that we're seeing a little bit of suburban sprawl or urban sprawl in both of those locations. I drive back and forth. So every time I drive to Sioux Falls, which is, twice a week, I'm like, wow, this is a whole new building that's going up. So there is a lot of development going on even in our area. And especially in our communities, in our suburban areas, and even if you live in the center of town, a lot of these expansion of our communities is also equates to an expansion of turf grass or green space. So lawn or turf covers more surface area than any other irrigated crop in the US, which is about approximately 63,000 square miles. And with that turf grass, it just uses a lot of resources. $40 billion is the amount that's used for lawn care every year in our country. 90 million pounds of fertilizer, 78 million pounds of pesticides, and about 200 gallons of water per person per day. So I've heard lawns be described as a needy baby. I've talked about that before. It's because they're always needing something from us. They need to be watered, or they need to be fed, or they need to be tended to. And so it's definitely something that is using a lot of resources, but not necessarily producing much or being like a valuable part of our ecosystem as much as some other plant material could be. Also, I'm sure that many of you have seen these two plants around in your communities. I think if I had $1 for every time I saw Stella d'Oro lily and Carl Forester grass, I would probably be able to retire. And most of the time when you see these planted, it's in landscaping rock. So when you are seeing areas that aren't necessarily turf grass, especially outside of businesses or organizations and community spaces, it's very homogeneous. I mean, you see these two plants everywhere with just, maybe a little bit of variability. But we really can do a lot better. There are so many plants out there that not necessarily native plants, but there is a plethora of plants. And it'd be a lot more fun and interesting if we kind of expanded our plant palette in our communities. So today I'm going to talk primarily about native plants. So what is a native plant? Well, native plants are those plants that have developed in a specific region or ecosystem over hundreds or thousands of years without human introduction. So that means, we have plants that are native to North America. We also have plants that would be considered native to our ecoregion or specifically to South Dakota. So it really kind of depends on the, where you're located as to what is considered a native plant for your spot. And native plants support all of our other biodiversity. They support our insects, they support our birds and the other wildlife. You can see here some of the different insect and bird species, pollinators. And Amanda talked a lot about insects, and they have all kinds of benefits, but also if you're interested in birds, birds require lots and lots and lots of insects to be able to survive and to raise their young. Unfortunately, I didn't put any polls in my presentation like Laura did for her grasslands talk, but an interesting fact that I didn't know was that some bird species require about 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to raise their clutch of young. That's a huge amount of caterpillars. So if we want songbirds in our backyards, we also need to be planting things for insects, which will also then be part of the food chain for our songbirds. So it's all connected, as I'm sure many of you know, in an ecosystem. And we also heard last week from Anthony Bly about soil and John McMain about water, but native plants really do a huge amount of benefit for our soil and our water quality. We saw a similar slide on Tuesday about the root depth of our native plants. So this is a little bit different of a diagram, but it just shows the root depth of our native plants compared to some of our non-native landscaping species like this one is in Kentucky bluegrass. It's a fescue turf. We've got some fountain grass, some of those Stella d'Oro daylilies, and a spirea shrub. And really the difference in organic material under the soil for those native plants is huge. And those roots, as they kind of break down and form organic matter, that's allowing our soil to act as a sponge that will hold a lot more of that water on the landscape. Those deep roots also help prevent erosion. They help infiltrate more water, and they also provide a good microbial habitat for all of the microorganisms that cycle nutrients and sequester carbon in our soil. So native plants are extremely important for our soil and water quality. And as I mentioned, native plants also require fewer inputs and maintenance once they're established. It's not to say that you can just like plant them in the ground and forget about them. But once they're established, you don't need to spray them with herbicides or pesticides, and you don't need to do a lot of watering, really depending on the year. Once they're established, most of the native plants that I've planted, I'll water a couple times, or if it's midsummer, maybe throughout the really dry season of the summer, but then I haven't gone back and watered them again over the last couple of years. And the majority of them, almost all of those plants have done just fine. And native plants can also provide a lot of benefits to us as well, to our health and our well-being. They help to clean the air and the water, as I mentioned, and really not even just native plants, but all plants. So trees, anything that's a growing plant is going to help clean the air. But our native plants also provide that diverse microbial community in the soil, which also helps our human microbiome. They really contribute to our sense of kind of like heritage and our place. The grasslands video was really, really touching actually, as far as like, here's where we live and this is what it means to live on a prairie, and trying to incorporate some of those plants into our own communities and into our backyards can really help us feel connected to that in a way that maybe you don't necessarily think about all the time. And so even small habitat patches with native plants are important. As part of my research, I did a lot of looking into like habitat patches. Of course, connectivity between those patches is even more important. So it's wonderful if you have small little boulevard strips or native plantings or pocket prairies in your yard. But then the more people that do that provides kind of a native plant matrix in our communities. And so that is providing even more benefits to our pollinators and our wildlife and all of these ecosystem benefits that we've been talking about this whole last 2 weeks. But so you might be thinking, do I have to feel guilty if I don't want to convert my entire yard to native plants? Well, the answer to that is no, you don't have to feel guilty. It's definitely something that's becoming more popular, is incorporating all of these native plants into your yard, but it doesn't mean that you have to have a like full-scale transformation in order to feel like you're doing anything beneficial. So, there are lots of plants out there, as I mentioned, not just native plants. And all of those plants have a lot of different benefits. Plus, we need to eat. So I read a really interesting quote from, I think it was David Holmgren. He's somebody in the permaculture field. He said, if we all convert our yards to native plants, that means we still have to outsource, a lot of the food production that we would have normally done in our gardens. So it's actually very, I think, realistic and almost even more beneficial if we can integrate our vegetable gardens and some of our ornamental plants and our native plants into our yards all together. And so I'm a big proponent of not limiting ourselves, but kind of expanding our horizons as far as plants go in our yards. So a couple ways that we can all kind of help our backyard biodiversity, our insects, our pollinators, by incorporating all kinds of plants. So first, even a vegetable garden provides, food for pollinators and insects. I know sometimes that food that's being provided to the insects is our food too, so we get a little bit annoyed. But vegetable gardens actually do support a wide range of insects and pollinators. And if you incorporate flowers that pollinators like into your vegetable garden or around your vegetable garden, that helps in many different ways as far as pest control with your vegetables and also just kind of beauty in your garden. And they don't just have to be native plants. There's a lot of plants, like Amanda mentioned, there's dill, parsley, there's alyssum, there's zinnias. There's a lot of plants that still provide a nectar source for a lot of our pollinators and insects, as well as just maintaining the health of your existing trees are important. Many of our insects use trees as their kind of like host plants as well, and especially oak trees. So I'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a minute. Um, so that was, that's kind of what you can do. You can plant a garden. That would be a pretty easy first step. Even better than that would be to add some keystone tree species when possible, especially native keystone trees. So there's an entomologist named Doug Tallamy who's done some research on what types of plants support which types of insect species, and found that there's certain keystone plants that really are kind of the top of this whole like ecosystem web. And even planting a couple of those in your yard can make a huge difference in as far as the number of insect species that your yard can provide habitat for. So example, oak is actually one of the top keystone species. It can actually support about 253 different butterfly and moth caterpillar species. Next would be the prunus species, like our American plum would be a native version of a plum, and the black cherry is a native cherry, and that supports about 200 different species. And you can see down the line there's a lot of trees that we see that are common in our yards and our landscaping. I think hackberry is another good tree for supporting insects. So that's a good first step. If you're going to be replacing a tree in your yard, think about replacing a tree with one of these keystone species. And so you can find what these keystone species are if you go to the National Wildlife Federation website. It's linked there, but I can throw it into the chat later. And they have a whole like plant finder by ecoregion. So our ecoregion is the Great Plains. So you just type in Great Plains, there's a couple other websites where you can type in your zip code, and it will provide you with a list of those keystone species, not just trees, but also shrubs and the flowers as well. And so replacing keystone trees in your yard is important, but also if you do have some of those invasive shrubs or perennials, replacing those with natives would be the next best thing that you can do. So, there's a few plants that are really common in landscaping. They're often still sold at landscape centers. A couple of those would be Japanese barberry and burning bush. You also see those plants everywhere. People love burning bush because of like the really pretty leaf color, especially in the fall. But there are great native alternatives to those shrubs. Common ninebark is a really great shrub that is really hardy for our environment. There are some different cultivars of ninebark, and some of the research done has shown that those cultivars actually are just as supportive of our insects as the straight native variety. So I would say definitely replace any of those invasive shrubs with some good native perennials. Let's see. However, if you really want to go all out and make your entire yard a habitat for all of the living creatures, including yourself, research by Doug Tallamy has shown that if you can make 70% of the plants in your yard to be native, including keystone trees, shrubs, and perennials, then that will support the largest amount of bird species. Or you need at least 70% of the plants in order to like really have a positive impact on those songbird species. So doing that, planting as many native plants as you can in your foundational plantings around your garden, throughout your lawn, kind of expand it. You see those foundational plantings, and if you can just even bump out those foundational plantings so that you're encroaching into the lawn space and putting the native plants into there, that is also kind of a nice, slow and easy way that you can do that. And if you really want to go all out, you can convert your lawn to a bee lawn or a native lawn. So a bee lawn is usually a pretty, lower maintenance lawn alternative that has a mixture of low growing plants. A lot of times there's clover mixed into that. Sometimes there's self-heal, creeping thyme, a mixture of different fescues, which aren't necessarily all native plants, but they do provide resources for pollinators, especially earlier in the season. You don't have to mow them as often. And so that's an alternative. And I know there are also some native lawn alternatives. There's a few different people who have buffalo grass lawns or blue grama integrated into their lawns. And so that's really great if you have a sunny yard, but they probably aren't going to do as well if you have a lot of shade. So some good alternatives if you have shady lawn is different sedges. So you can either do more of a mulch with kind of sedges intermingled throughout that area, or you can try to do a whole lawn conversion into sedges, and like a mixture of other fescues and things like that would probably work really well too. Another native plant, native forb that really goes well in maybe those bee lawns or native lawns is the low growing field pussy toes or Antonaria neglecta. That's kind of a really fun one that looks kind of, the seed head or flower looks like a pussy willow, and it's soft and fuzzy. And so that is another plant that is good to incorporate into your lawn. So you really can, if you have a thick turf, like green grass lawn, it might be hard to establish some of these things without doing some aeration and maybe seeding into some of those like holes left in your yard. But there are definitely ways that you can start to convert your lawn into a native or a bee-friendly lawn. So I'm just going to go over quickly some of the plants that work well for our area. I've talked about this before. I try to like vary it a little bit depending on what audience I'm talking to. But first, I'll talk a little bit about some of the plants, the native plants that are good in sun for spring. We've got our prairie smoke. That's a really fun one. Kind of looks like a Dr. Seuss truffula tree. That's the seed head of the prairie smoke. And it's just a really early spring bloomer. And it also has this nice kind of basal rosette of leaves that make a good ground cover throughout the rest of the season. That golden Alexander is in the carrot family, and it is a host plant for the black swallowtail butterfly. So, you can have dill, you can have parsley or fennel, but then you can also integrate some of these native golden Alexanders as well into your landscaping. The penstemon species, like the foxglove beard tongue, these are good for bumblebees, and they're also an early spring plant. The bumblebees like that tubular flower. So plants for sun in the summer, this Western Pearly Everlasting is a good one, and that's also a host plant for the painted lady butterfly. One of my favorites is lead plant. It kind of grows in dry, sunny conditions, but it's also a nitrogen fixer. So some of these native plants actually have dual purposes, because if you integrate them in some of your other landscaping, that's another reason why you don't need fertilizer, because some of these native plants, the prairie clovers and the lead plant, will help to provide nitrogen to the other plants. Of course, all of our milkweeds support our monarch butterfly populations. Butterfly milkweed is a really great one for landscaping. It's pretty well behaved. It doesn't spread as much as some of the common milkweed does, and it's got these really pretty orange flowers. Some plants for the fall. Any type of an aster is going to be really a good food source for bees as they're moving into winter. This is an aromatic aster, but there's smooth blue aster. New England aster is a common one that you might see at your garden centers. And they will keep blooming all the way up into maybe even early November if we're having a mild fall. Showy goldenrod is a good one, and I really love the combination of goldenrod and asters together. I think it's really pretty with the yellow and purple. And they also have pretty similar like behavior, so they both can potentially spread a little bit, but if you plant them together, they kind of keep each other in check. And any of the Liatris species, the blazing stars, are really great for butterflies and bees. You'll see monarchs all over them in the fall as well. So we live in the prairie, so we mostly have plants for the sun, but there are still plenty of plants that you can plant if you've got more of a shady yard. I just have a couple highlighted here. Many of you probably are familiar with the red columbine or the wild columbine. That's got a pretty red flower in the spring, kind of grows in woodland or partial shade environments. In the summer, a nodding onion is a good one. It's not going to have the giant like globe flower head like some of your globe alliums, but it does have these really pretty little nodding onion flower heads, and the pollinators love that as well. And then here's another goldenrod that actually does well in shade, the zigzag goldenrod. So that's a really fun one if you do have a shady area and you want a bright pop of color in the fall. We've got some plants for a rain garden, common ironweed. That one grows really tall, about 5 to 7 feet tall. So you just might need to keep that in mind as far as placement goes. Marsh marigold is a really pretty yellow plant for the spring. Swamp milkweed, of course, another milkweed, good for monarchs. And actually, Grace Vilmo, the NPI graduate student that Amanda was just talking about, her research was on monarch egg-laying preferences and which milkweeds they prefer the best. And actually, what she found was swamp milkweed was one of the top milkweeds that um, that monarchs preferred to lay their eggs on, and she also found the most caterpillars on swamp milkweed. And this can grow in a rain garden, but it actually grows pretty well in more dry conditions also. And then Joe Pyeweed is just a favorite of all kinds of pollinators. I see bees and butterflies all over this in the summer. And so that's kind of one of my favorite plants that prefers maybe a moisture area. We can't forget about the grasses and sedges. I'm not going to go through all of these, but our prairie plants were in a grassland ecosystem, so trying to plant a whole bunch of native flowers without incorporating some grasses isn't going to be kind of ecologically as beneficial for the whole environment and for the plants. So a lot of our native plants, if you try to grow those in your backyard environment where you have rich soil, a lot of times they'll tend to get a little bit taller than you might expect, and they could start to flop over. So incorporating some of these grasses into your native plantings is a really good way to have some of that root competition and overall competition with the native plants, similar to what they have evolved to be in that type of environment. So it will really kind of help them to not get quite so tall and scraggly looking. So a couple tips, you just want to make sure you have the right plant in the right place. These prairie plants, some of them are really good for wet conditions. Most of them are probably good for drier prairie conditions. So you just want to make sure that you're not trying to plant some of these sun-loving plants in the shade because they're just not going to do as well. You also really want to check your local regulations as far as height restrictions. Some places you can plant in the boulevards, sometimes you can't. Sometimes there's height restrictions. And so that's just something to keep in mind as far as, maybe you can't transform your entire front yard into a 3-foot meadow without getting in trouble with the city or your neighbors. So you do need to look into that. And then as far as native plantings go, something called cues to care is really important. Especially if you're planting more of a pollinator garden where maybe you're using a seed mix and it kind of, the plants all grow together, and, sometimes people have the perception of that as messy looking. So a cue to care is just something that is included in the planting design so that it's immediately recognizable as intentional. So whether that's a sculpture, whether that's a fence like in the middle picture, whether that's a specific sign that indicates that it's a pollinator habitat, those things are really important in some of your native plantings, just to let people know that, hey, this is intentional. This is something that I'm trying to do on purpose. I'm not just a neglectful lawn owner. So I think that's really important to keep in mind as well. So really, I just kind of want to leave you all with kind of a summary of this whole Backyard Natural Resources webinar. We talked about soil, we talked about water, we talked about insects and other biodiversity and our grasslands. And really, I think native plants kind of tie all that together, because not only do they help improve our soil, they help manage and conserve our water, They support birds, pollinators, and other insects, and they also provide beauty and additional benefits to our landscape. So native plants really fit the bill if you're really interested in all aspects of improving your backyard natural resources. As I mentioned, you certainly can have your vegetable garden and your ornamental plants as well. I planted a lot of native plants, but I also love zinnias and cosmos and hollyhocks, so I probably will always have those in my backyard. But I just want to encourage people to branch out a little bit beyond the normal, like ornamental flowers and plants that you might see at the garden centers, and really know that there's a whole world of plants out there, and you know, it's a lot of fun to try them all out. So here's a few resources. Here at SDSU, we have the Native Plant Initiative. They have plant sales every summer, so that's a good resource. There's a few places in Sioux Falls that also sell some different native plants. And then there's some different native plant resources available online. The Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center has details about all types of different native plants if you just type in the plant that you're interested in. Wild Ones and Grow Native both have like landscape design examples for how to incorporate native plants. And then there's just a host of other places if you're interested in starting down that native plant journey. So here's my contact information. We will put our normal backyard natural resources survey in the chat, but this is an additional like just interest about native plants and landscaping survey. So I know we're kind of bombarding everybody with surveys, but we're just trying to learn as much from you about what you're interested in as we're trying to provide information. So anyway, with that, think that's all I've got, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that anybody might have.
It looks like there's one in the Q&A for you.
Okay.
They plan to convert the rest of their backyard into native grasses this year, likely with buffalo grass and a blue grama mix. They might put in the Dutch white clover, but their question is how to prep the existing turf. Till, cardboard, black plastic, what they want to seed in August or September.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
site prep is important.
yeah, site prep actually is one of the most important things, and I can attest to that because I had I had one of my graduate projects that had some inconsistent site prep just with, working with other organizations, and I'd have to say that that really really put a damper on the project. Depending on the size of your backyard, I would recommend probably either the cardboard with the mulch or even the black plastic or a tarp. I do not recommend tilling. That is just going to expose a whole bunch of weed seeds from the weed seed bed, and then you're just going to be fighting weeds for probably the rest of the planting life. So if you have the resources as far as like access to cardboard, or if you have a black plastic or tarp, I'd probably recommend that. Solarizing it throughout the rest of this summer, especially if it's in a sunny location, is probably going to be the best bet as far as not having to use chemicals for a fall seeding. That usually works pretty well, because if the grass gets hot enough to die, then that dead grass will even provide a little bit of cover and kind of biomass that then you can overseed your native turf mix into.
And I did put the ecoregion link in the chat for you.
Oh, perfect.
I Googled that while you were presenting, so we got that one in
Okay.
there.
Oh yeah, I see in the chat that the red columbine, somebody has seen a hummingbird flying around them. And yes, so those red kind of tubular flowers, the hummingbirds really love those as well. All right, I'm gonna stop share, I guess, and I think I've got my surveys. Oh, I don't have the surveys pulled up because I had to restart my computer. Um, so let me just get that quickly.
Yeah, and while, this was a short series that's over for this year, we will be on garden hour throughout the season, both Robin and myself on various nights. So that's Tuesdays at 7 Central, 6 Mountain. You can always submit, if you think of a question after this, you can always drop a question to the Ask Extension widget. You can tune in to Garden Hour, or you can email either one of us directly, and we'll get it to the right person if we don't know what the answer is.
Yep. All right, I've just got that survey for the backyard natural resources in the chat. So
Awesome. Well, yeah, unless I don't see any other questions coming in, and we're almost at an hour. So
mhm.
thank you, Robin, for coming up with this idea
Oh,
and helping to get all the speakers and stuff together. This was
yeah,
great.
yeah, this was a lot
Uh,
of fun.
Thank you to the attendees that joined us live and that are watching the recording. It's been a great way to learn from some other experts that I wouldn't have normally gotten a chance to hear from, especially grassland, soil health, water resources over here in my little entomology silo.
Mhm.
But yes, so thank you everybody for attending. We'll see you on the recordings, and we'll hopefully see you at some of our other programming throughout the summer.
Yep. And I just want to add that I know hopefully now with this series, people can see like how connected everything really is. And it's all important and it all works together. So,
Yep.
all right. Thank you so much, Amanda, as
Awesome.
well.
Yeah.
And we'll see you later.